learning differences, and struggling to learn. Let's dive right into learning differences. We're going to begin with dyslexia because dyslexia or reading learning difference is the most common. 1 in 5 children and or adults have dyslexia. That's 20% of our general population. 70% are never diagnosed. So that's only 30% of students generally in school at school age will find out that they have this learning difference called dyslexia. They will find out that their brains learn differently. Outcomes for those who are diagnosed and do receive intervention plans are much better than those who are never diagnosed. 85% of IEP plans are for dyslexia. They will be deemed an eligibility criteria for something called specific learning disability of reading. So it is defined differently if you're in the academic setting versus being in a medical setting, or during the testing process with a psychologist. But do understand they are the same thing. Many times I've talked to parents, I've worked with families that are told by the medical field, a psychologist, a doctor, a physician, a therapist, that we need to get you tested for dyslexia. Please talk to your school district. But when they go talk to the schools, they're told, oh, we don't do that. That is what happens. It is a lingo issue, it is a terminology issue, but they are the same thing. And we'll probably do another YouTube segment on that topic. 62% will drop out before the end of high school. Often this is the population that falls within that never diagnosed group. 30% of those with dyslexia also have attention deficit concerns. They can look like ADD or they can look like ADHD. That is defined, attention deficit is defined differently than these terms ADD and ADHD now, but that does exist and is comorbid with dyslexia about 30% of the time. 70% of inmates are deemed to also have a learning disability. When you consider the dropout rate and you consider that we have about a 42% reading proficiency level in third grade, so about 42% of third graders nationwide can read at a third grade level. That percentage goes down when we get up to 8th grade, and then the 11th grade standard goes down from there. So we do have a lot of situations where there are learning disabilities within incarcerated individuals. 50% of U.S. adults can't read at a high school level. We'll get into more of that on other lectures. Let's talk about ADD and ADHD a little bit. So this occurs about 1 in 15 children. There's been about a 10% increase since 2007, and about 40% of children affected do not receive treatment. That means 40% do go undiagnosed. Generally, more than not, it is the young girls. They don't get diagnosed because their presentation of ADD and ADHD in the classroom setting is often very different than our young boys in most cases. Not all the time, but it is more common to see a undiagnosed female versus diagnosed male because they present themselves differently. There's less behavior concerns with the females. They tend to keep to themselves. They tend to inward regulate their difficulties versus the outward regulation of it, as our young boys do. 35% will also drop out of high school, and 45% are suspended at some point during their academic career. Dysgraphia, which is also defined as written expression difficulty within the motor components of written expression, occurs approximately 6 to 11% of school-age children are affected. This impacts their ability to produce legible written work, so they struggle with getting letters on the page, words on the page, reversals, sizing. It's very illegible to read. There are fine motor concerns often, and this often is a written expression issue, but more on the motor control, the motoric control of written expression, of fine motor skills, of their upper extremity coordination, than it is the true term written expression when we consider context, written context on the page, organizing paragraphs on the page. So they're a little different, but it does follow under the realm of specific learning disability of written expression. Dyscalculia is related to math difficulty. It occurs even less in the population, but it does overlap with dysgraphia often, and it can be seen with dyslexia in about 12 to 18% of the population. Other concerns that we see along with these particular learning differences include executive functioning disorders and difficulty. All of these are considered executive functioning disorders. ADD, ADHD specifically is defined as executive functioning being the primary deficit. It also is comorbid in these other cases about 60% of the time. So there's more going on often with someone who is dyslexic beyond the reading difficulty they're having. The executive function is deemed the what I like to call adulting 101 skills. So these are the skills we need to have in our lives to be an adult. So they are about prioritizing our time. They're about initiating activities, finishing tasks, working memory, attention span, our ability to regulate our internal systems and have self-control when we need it. So those are some of the areas of executive functioning. And about 60% of the time we see this occur in these populations. Some other things to know about learning differences is that this is from the CDC, and I just want to put it out there because since about 2020, we're seeing this more and more. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for people in the age bracket of 10 to 34. 25 states have seen suicide rate increases by more than 30% in the last decade. That is a huge number. 70% of young people will say they've witnessed somebody being bullied. Okay, young children and adults with learning differences are often targeted by bullies at significantly higher rates than even these statistics give us. They are 4 times more likely to be bullied. They are also 2 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts, deal with depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder. One thing we want to keep in mind is that chronic stress and anxiety, because we're going to get into dyslexia and dysgraphia and ADHD, chronic stress and anxiety causes changes in the brain. It causes changes to the DNA. It causes changes at the cellular level. It causes changes in our neurotransmitters, being able to do their jobs neurologically in the brain to allow new learning to occur at a rate that is efficient and without undue stress on the body and the brain. So this does change our DNA, and it changes our neurology, our neurobiology at the cellular level. So how does it feel to learn differently? So chances are, if you open this and are listening to this still, you either know someone who learns differently, you parent someone who learns differently, you teach someone who learns differently, you have experienced this in one way or another. So to learn differently often means for those people impacted most by it that they feel stressed, they feel anxious, they feel depressed, angry, discouraged, embarrassed, stupid. They desire to give up on tasks way easily because of their emotional stress, and they are emotionally exhausted. And this is the child dealing with this, or the young adult dealing with this, and the parent alike. I specifically can tell you that this is true. There's tons of research out there that supports this as well. But as a parent of a child with a learning difference, I have been in this seat. I have been depressed and anxious and stressed and overwhelmed with what is in store in our future. So I want to speak to those parents out there and to those students out there that may have clicked on this. You learn differently. You don't have a learning disability. I don't like the term learning disability. I don't feel that it is an appropriate term to utilize when we are talking about dyslexia and dysgraphia and ADHD. Our brains are wired, these brains are wired to learn differently. And what society has not learned is how to teach differently. Okay, so essentially this is really more appropriately labeled a teaching disability than it is a learning disability. And I'm a firm believer in that. And my goal is to teach everyone to learn how to teach those that learn differently to their strengths instead of to their weaknesses. And then in that we can strengthen their weaknesses and still teach them everything they need to know through their strengths. Okay, so this is the big golden apple, the big piece to the lecture is what is the missing piece? Why do these kids struggle to learn even when we've identified they have a learning disability, even when we've intervened? Why do I put all this time and effort and energy into the therapy programs and the things, and it doesn't seem like anything's working? Okay. I will add some more things, some more nice little things to put on here that are little short snippets over the upcoming weeks that explain this in more detail, the foundational skills that build into reading and writing skills. But we need to talk about the cycle of failure. We need to talk about how we get from a child who is open and willing and happy to be at school and try to put an effort forth to a kid that is shutting down on us, who is crying every night, having panic attacks, or maybe they're destroying the classroom, throwing chairs. Maybe they're coming home and they are just angry at the world. Okay, they're taking out their aggression and anger on their parents, their siblings, their friends. So we need to discuss what's happening here. So what I want everyone to understand is when we first start the skill of learning, as long as there's no trauma to the brain, there's no kind of massive trauma, physical trauma that has occurred during the birthing process, and we have a typically performing brain, there is always motivation and effort to attempt a test the very first time we do it. Okay, very rarely it does occur in some cases with seizure disorders and other neuro type of situations, but the large majority of people have motivation and effort to attempt to learn a new task, whether it's riding a bike, learning to read, picking up that crayon for the first time. But what happens very, very quickly and very, very early in our academic learning is that we do a task and we have one of two things that happen, or one of three things that happen. We're successful is one route. Then we can be actually unsuccessful at the task, that first attempt, right? Or we can perceive that we were not successful. Success is going to run into very efficient learning and we're going to do great and we move on into the next skill set. And then we want to talk about more about perceived lack of success and actual lack of success. So no matter where we sit along that spectrum, they are filed in the brain the very same way. Whether we perceive ourselves as lack of not being successful and we actually were, or we actually were not successful. Whether that feedback's coming from the teacher, the peer, the classroom, the outdoor environment, it is filed in the brain negatively and it's going to lead into frustration. Okay. Really, we would like to see intervention start at this time. When those first signs of frustration start to occur with a child, we should be intervening at that moment. But this is early K3, sometimes K4, and just generally in the United States, our general intervention plan for most kids is identifying and intervening by third grade, if we're lucky, in most cases. We have to, before we can even consider a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD, the AMA will say we have to be 7 years old. That's almost second grade. So kind of keep in mind as we start to have these things, these happen very much earlier, 4 or 5 years old. We start to get frustration. When frustration starts to build and build and build, we get decreased self-efficacy. We don't believe we can do the task. We start to get into that, we're gaining a lower self-worth, essentially. We're incapable. I can't do it. I'm not going to be able to do it. It's too hard. Okay. When that happens enough times, we're going to develop anxiety and task avoidance. Okay. When we start to avoid a task, whatever that task looks like, it's going to cause lost opportunity to improve that skill. Because like anyone would do, if we're not good at something or we feel like we're not good and it causes us to be anxious, we're going to avoid it. We're going to figure out a way to get around having to participate in that particular skill set in the classroom. That's going to be your kid that gets a tummy ache and wants to go see the nurse at exactly 9:05 every morning. I wonder why that's happening, right? The kid that wants to go sharpen their pencil 80 times a day, and it seems to happen right before we go into small reading group. These are the kind of things we're looking for. We're looking for trends. When is it happening? Why are we losing that opportunity? When we have loss of opportunity, we lose the motivation to succeed. So we're starting to fall further and further behind our peers, the other people who are working on that same skill set at the same time. So we lose motivation to even want to succeed, which then affects our self-esteem, then develops into the Matthew effect, which is that those that read and do more reading and are successful at that reading process are going to gain skills. They're going to start reading more involved text. They're going to start wanting to do the chapter books, and then the bigger chapter books, and then bigger books beyond that point. And then those that struggle in those beginning cycles of reading, we may see it in our CVCs, we may see it in our blends, but we may not see it till later, till we're doing 3-syllable words. So it's very variable. There's a spectrum of these disorders from mild to severe, but once the Matthew effect starts to take hold, then we start to risk further emotional disturbance and behavior problems. Often this is when I get kids in my clinic. When we get to the level of emotional disturbance or behavior problem, I get a referral, okay? Or I get referrals in 2nd and 3rd grade sometimes because the reading and writing is not where it needs to be. And sometimes that happens because I'm not with the school system. I do it in a different setting. And then I'm having to advocate as a dyslexia advocate for IEPs, advocate to get the things in place so IEPs can happen quicker, faster, without having to wait months and months, going through 3 tiers of RTI, and on and on and on. So what we need to do is we're trying to stop the cycle of failure as early in the cycle as possible to prevent more loss of skill, to prevent more behavior problems and more emotional distress, more self-regulation concerns, so that we can close the gap that's already started to be created and give them the skill set they need so they can be successful. Okay, so going into the cycle of failure, we've kind of covered this to some extent, but a successful reader is motivated, confident, reads more, accepts challenge of more complex tests. We increase skill, we increase knowledge, right? But then we have a struggling reader that doesn't have effective intervention, but they start to learn to avoid the task, right? They're getting made fun of. They're called stupid, called a loser. The things the kids tell me their peers are saying to them, and sometimes their teachers are saying to them, is just awful. They will lose self-esteem and motivation, and they will avoid the task. And the more they do this cycle, the gap grows bigger and bigger and bigger until something changes. And sometimes that gap is, 8 months to a year. Sometimes it's 4 or 5 or 6 years wide. So what we want to keep in mind is that this failure cycle starts with a certain skill set, but then it starts to expand and generalize and go into all these other skills that is the foundation of. So for reading, when do we read? We read in the classroom. We read a book. We have to read our homework. We have to read the assignment. We might have to do a reading piece to be able to complete an assignment. We have to read the instructions on a test. And what else do we have to read? Think about older kids. We have to read to take our driver's license permit. We have to read a menu at the restaurant to figure out what we want to eat. We have to read an application for a part-time job or a full-time job. We have to read the text from our friends. Maybe we're not able to understand the context or the sarcasm or all the different pieces that come with that. And so that can cause more issues with our peers as we're moving from the actual academic pieces into social skills. So the more we have those social difficulties, the more emotional we are. We are very social beings, humans are, and we desire and crave to be around other people and to engage with others. And when we're not able to do that well, or our peers are disengaging from us, it can cause more behavioral and emotional difficulties. So in that, as that grows, we can see decreased self-efficacy, learned helplessness, more anxiety, more depression. So no matter what the experience is, whether it's a good experience or a bad experience, we classify it in the brain neurologically so we can recall on it and use it as a foundational level of a skill set and recall it to be able to do that skill again or build on that skill, build on our knowledge and our emotional maturity. But when that becomes a bad memory or a bad recall that we have to pull every time, we're causing the brain to then pull up a negative experience over and over and over again, over time, the brain will start to process that as self-protection, that it has to protect itself from this skill because it brings in cortisol, which is a stress hormone, causes more stress to the body and the brain, and then we start to perceive it as painful, uncomfortable, and then as dangerous to ourselves. When we get to this point, we have activated the central nervous system in a way that it activates what's called the sympathetic nervous system response, which is our fight or flight freeze response. So when that happens, we are in self-protection. We are in defensive mechanisms of protecting ourselves at all costs because we have perceived this as dangerous to ourselves, harmful to ourselves. So it causes more social and more academic difficulties when this occurs. It can also train the brain to avoid, disengage, or process this skill as a threat. And when the brain decides to do this, we've activated the brainstem, we've activated fight or flight, freeze. We are going to fight back against anybody or anything forcing us into this skill. We are going to run away from, get away from, or we're going to freeze. We're going to, go into fight or flight freeze responses. Over time, when this is not addressed, it leads to more behavior issues, of course, as you can imagine, but it's also going to lead to more anxiety. And so to the point that it's becoming so significant, we will end up getting diagnosed with anxiety disorder, diagnosed with generalized depression, diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes, I have worked with students who have been diagnosed 5th grade, 7th grade with post-traumatic stress disorder that stemmed from a learning disability. Okay, so when this trauma, and this is more emotional trauma, when I say trauma, remains unresolved, positive and effective emotional responses are unlikely to occur. And even small levels of anxiety over time, because that cortisol level builds up in the brain, can disrupt the learning process and our ability to learn a skill. So this is where I said this is the number one reason our kids with learning difficulties struggle to learn, is we have disrupted the learning process with anxiety, with depression, with these emotional responses that are telling the brain to no, don't proceed. We cannot do this. We've got to activate fight or flight and protect our body and our brain at all costs. Okay, this is the emotional state. This emotional state, when it occurs, has a direct correlation to learning. So when we go into fight or flight, when we go into self-protection, we are activating a system in the brain that is its primary development system. So it does not allow the cortex, the higher centers of the brain, to do their job for learning. So it does the opposite of learning. It puts us into self-protection. Be on alert. Red signs are going up, red flashing lights, danger, danger, danger. We cannot proceed. So it's going to impact our ability to learn. Students will perform best, of course, when they feel secure, confident, engaged, and safe. When they feel safe, their brain then opens up to the learning process. Everything is firing neurologically in the brain well, and we can apply new learning concepts. But when we feel unsafe or we're anxious, this will literally impede the ability to learn. It stops it in its tracks. Okay? So when we have learning differences, these students are often the targets of bullying and shaming by society. Okay? They're often made to feel less than their peers. And that often happens because peers aren't aware that they're doing this. They want to call us stupid and lazy and tell us we're worthless and weird and all the things. But there's really a lack of general knowledge about learning differences. These populations are very more likely to attempt suicide than the general population. It's something we have to really be very, very concerned about. So here's some examples in my personal experience that have happened to me myself. Facebook, I'm in lots of different groups for lots of different purposes, but I see this on the general consensus of learning differences is very negative. It's very mislabeled. It's very misconstrued, but very negative. Okay. So people will say things like this on social media. I'm very proud of my community, for the most part, are very highly educated, and they jump back into this with responses, which is wonderful. we don't need to assume that somebody with a learning disability is not intelligent. Okay, that is the definition of a learning difference, is the intelligence level is there, but they're still struggling in some way, whether that's written expression, writing, reading, math, attention, to get those skills down, right, at the level their peers are, as quick as their peers are. Okay, so it's something we have to be concerned about, and we need to be educating at every pass people in the general population that do not understand this. Okay, this is from a wonderful book called Differently Wired. I love it. There's also a podcast devoted to it. But these are actual comments from families and the students themselves that deal with this. So it is very real. I myself am the mother of a child with a learning difference. I've been on the receiving end of a lot of these feelings. Okay, my daughter has had a lot of these feelings. So it's very important that we recognize that 1 in 5 students. So if you're a teacher watching this, listening to this, look in your classroom. If you have 25 kids in there, you're going to have at least 4 or 5 kids in there that are struggling. Don't disconsider. Don't think it's because they're not paying attention. It's they're too busy, playing. There is the very real reality that there is something else there. There's a learning difference there. Okay, so we want to be very aware and free of judgment when it comes to our kids that struggle and our adults that struggle. There's not a lot of support. So a couple of these comments, because our experience is not validated, they're not understood by much of society, we are left with high levels of worry, loneliness, insecurity, guilt, and sadness. We are self-shamed. We are judged from people who only see our child's weaknesses and miss out on getting to know the creative, bright, and complicated person that lives inside. Emotionally, I was a wreck, experiencing some form of embarrassment, shame, anger, or confusion on a daily basis, mostly stemming from the pressure I placed on myself. Okay? I've been conditioned to apologize for being me because I had to do it at school all the time. I cannot tell you the amount of kids I see who every 3 minutes we're in conversation or we're playing, they are apologizing. And this is something I really work hard with my kids and my families to work on. You do not have to apologize for that. There are times when apologies are necessary, but the large majority of the time we're not going to apologize for being who we are, for saying an answer wrong, saying a word wrong, sounding out a word wrong, writing a word incorrectly, spelling wrong. These are not things we apologize for. Okay? This other one could not help but feel that I was failing as a parent. That hits you in the feels right there. I felt like I was feeding him to the sharks every time I dropped him off each morning. I have worked with so many families who, when they do drop off in the morning, their kids were literally freaking out. They would have meltdowns. They would fight. There would be teachers having to pull them into the school. There's something happening if that's the situation, whether it's happening in the classroom and it's the environment, or it's internally happening for that child. We have to get to the bottom of what is going on. Okay? Some common comments I've seen in IEPs. So I do some IEP advocacy. So for anybody who's listening, watching, and maybe your kid is in a typical brick and mortar school, we need to be very aware of the things that are said in IEP meetings and the reasons that are given why a child may or may not get an IEP or 504. And we need to be very educated in what the law does say and what our rights are as parents, okay? And advocate for your children. So when things get said, I've done many IEP meetings, and many of these things have been said. Let's wait till 3rd grade to test. Let's give it some more time. We're going to do standardized testing again in a couple months. Let's put them in tier 1, 2, 3, fill in the blank, and let's try this. Let's look at this later. No. When the issue arises, we need testing immediately, okay? It's needed when it's needed. And national organizations, DSM, provide criteria, not schools, on a diagnosis. This is a compliance issue. If somebody says to you in an IEP meeting, I've never had a dyslexic student in my classroom, I'm not sure what to do, this needs to be directed to the administrator. Unless this is a first year teacher and this is our, we're in October of the school year, we need to be addressing this really quick because you have had one in your classroom, you just didn't know it. Okay? We don't have enough time, money, or resources. This is something should never be said to a parent in an IEP meeting. Okay? That is not a parent problem. It is the law that every child with any known disability, and I don't like the word disability, I don't think it's appropriate, learning difference, whether that's an eligibility criteria of learning difference or it's a diagnosis, should be served with evidence-based curriculums and be issued an IEP or 504 when they qualify for one. If we don't have the time, the money, resources, then they need to get a variance and go to a school that does. We don't really have a spelling curriculum. We just do worksheets and weekly tests. This is not appropriate for a dyslexic learner. It is absolutely necessary for dyslexics to have a spelling curriculum that is based on phonic retention and learning or phonemic awareness skills and building on those skills of open and closed syllables, and not just randomly selecting spelling words for a spelling test. Okay? They can't take an AP class because they have a learning disability. They can be tested for gifted if they have a learning disability. That is a big no. Okay? There are things known as self-dyslexia as an example of somebody who has a double profile. We have a learning difference or disability as it would be described in the school district, but we're also gifted. Okay? That's the same with AP. Just because someone has a reading difference or has attention concerns doesn't mean they're not very bright in science or math, or those particular subjects are very easy for them. We need to make sure they get the education they need. Okay, some other just common things that I've seen happen is I reposted this on Facebook. It was a Made by Dyslexia, which was one of my favorite organizations in the whole world. Posted, and I felt it in my heart that yes, this happens all the time, is that students talk out about how they're not being accommodated, but those that are giving the accommodations believe they're giving the accommodations the right way, but they're not. So what happened when I did this is I was just trying to advocate for this statement that was made by a student with a learning disability. So it's coming from the mouths of babes, and we're still not listening. And most people were like, got you, awesome, preach it. But then a colleague friend who happened to be a teacher started saying, I wish they wouldn't have misspelled the word. So we're not really paying attention to what the kids are saying, but what we can find wrong with what they're saying. So it became a big back and forth on Facebook with me and my friend. And yes, we're still friends, but me just trying to educate an educator who doesn't have the personal experience with this, okay? And it just kind of went on, but you kind of get the gist. These are other comments that I have seen. I've been in groups. So it happens all the time to people, different ages, different groups. Most of these are related. One is a dyscalculia sample, but the rest are pretty much dyslexia. So how it affected a young girl in her volleyball group of friends. Okay, so this again extends beyond reading skills. How it is affecting a mom emotionally, how she lost it and cried at work, and how a coworker knew her kid was dyslexic, and she was so proud of how well she was doing the 4th week of school, and the daughter was working so hard, and she was just talking to her peer about it, and then the peer says, dang, my kid could do all that in pre-K. It's this kind of stuff that impacts these families, and it's this kind of stuff that lets us know that there's so much misunderstanding of what these learning differences truly are. How one mom went to her pediatrician, a daughter's pediatrician wants to have her tested for learning disabilities other than dyslexia. I called her school and they're telling me you can't have a learning disability if you have an high IQ. Is this true? And I'm like, that is the definition. When there's nothing going on with IQ, but we're still not learning, that is the definition of a learning difference or disability, and we need to be troubleshooting why this is happening. Let's do some testing. Let's figure this out. Okay? And then this one about multiplication. So this is another dyscalculia likely issue. Could still be just dyslexia with some working memory. But just some examples. This is a continuation of the conversation I had with my friend, where I talked about lectures I've been to, lectures I've given, courses I've had, students I've spoken with, um, technology that's available, all kinds of different things about, when you have a spell check on your computer and they give you 4 or 5 solutions to misspelling a word, but you can't decode those 4 or 5 solutions, makes it kind of hard to pick the right word, right? And then you got homophones you're dealing with, all these other type of language components that you're dealing with that impact this population. So just giving her some advice on some new things that were coming out that might be more appropriate. And then this was just a little blog in my neighborhood, and then somebody decided to make a comment about people with dyslexia, with learning differences, and I just had to say something because it drove me crazy. But so this person was talking about parents becoming more aware of your child's weaknesses. So I went into this whole 2 pages of of information about what you don't understand when you say things like this. Please understand these are people with high IQs. Please understand that this is over 30 million people have undiagnosed learning disabilities. And we're criticizing and talking about parents not giving their kids proper education or children's weaknesses inappropriately. So it is not a disease to be cured. It is a way of thinking and learning. It is a difference. And then lastly, just, we'd love for you to subscribe. I'm going to start posting new content every week. So if you subscribe, you'll be able to get access to that. You can also join us on our social media. We're also creating more and more content. So this is where we'll share all that, share that information. Is on our Instagram, on our Facebook. Follow us on social media, and subscribe. And lastly, just kind of keeping aware, this is a very true statement where kids come into school districts with learning disabilities and they leave with emotional disturbances. This is something we have to be considering, and this is at the core of why our kids continue to struggle. Our kids that don't get diagnosed continue to struggle and have more adaptive emotional responses, continue down the cycle of failure. And then those that have intervention, sometimes that intervention is not working for them. Okay, and this is a big reason why. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.